Chapter 4. Winters were hard, especially for the goats who needed their grass, but we never stopped traveling. The goat man would wear holes right through his boots, repairing them as best he could with cardboard or tying them on with a string. It was funny how a new pair would always turn up just in the nick of time, and they'd always fit. People loved the goat man. He was doing what they would have liked to do, living in the open air, going where his mood took him. If it snowed, we'd shelter in a barn or under a canopy of trees. On warmer days, we'd find a stream and nap in the middle of the day. In the evening, when we'd settled ourselves at a campsite and had our dinner, the goat man would read us poetry by the light of the fire or play some tunes. I liked the sound of poetry, all right, but that accordion hurt my ears. If music be the food of love, play on, the goat man said. That's Shakespeare, Shep. He was pretty handy with words of wisdom, too. Nights were always the best. Even if it rained, I was right there next to my friend, all snuggled up inside the little wagon house as the rain danced on our roof. A good many dog years passed that way. I'd been growing into a right handsome beast, is how the goat man put it. It was sometime during our last year together, though neither of us knew it. We were in a place called Oregon, the goat man said, and the air had begun to cool. He was selling his words of wisdom cards the way he always did in the winter. He'd sell them wherever he could, hoarding a few coins he got to buy hay for the goats, and every now and then a meaty bone for me, even though I didn't earn my keep. I ran alongside the goats, keeping them in line, but they didn't need much herding. They'd gotten along fine without me. Still, I had to practice my skills. The goat man was older than I knew. People years were a mystery to me then. Toward the end of that long, cold winter, the goat man took sick. For some time we didn't travel, lying low behind an abandoned barn while the goat man slept. One night, as I lay warming his feet, he woke up and, as if he were still in a dream, began talking about Trudy. She must have been a real special person the way the goat man went on and on about her, but her father didn't like the goat man, who wasn't the goat man yet, just an ordinary farm boy. He wanted his pretty daughter to marry the son of a wealthy farmer. No amount of begging and crying was going to turn the father's cold heart away from that plan. The wealthy farmer's money was going to save their poor farm, and that was that. They were so in love, the goat man said, that there was no help for it. They had to be together. One night, with only a slice of the moon to see by, the goat man came with a ladder and set it up under Trudy's bedroom window. The two took off to the next county and married. How the goat man chuckled telling the story of the big escape, but then he began to cough and cough. After a while, he slept. Toward morning, when the goats were starting to rustle and snort, he picked up the story again. This part was so sad, I wish I'd slept through it. They made a good life for themselves, young as they were. Trudy took in washing. The goat man worked on a neighboring farm. In the spring, when Trudy said they'd be adding a child to their family, he was happier than he'd ever been in his life. True love is a banquet for the soul, the goat man said. But the birth was a hard one, not your usual thing. And when Trudy and their newborn son passed away shortly afterward, the goat man, who was not yet a goat man, became one. He left that little place with all the goats they had and never looked back. Love and grief grow in the same garden, the goat man said. Later that morning, we went back to the highway, but the goat man had slowed down some. He had to keep stopping so that he could catch his breath. After a while, he climbed up into his little house and left things to me. Well, the goats and I, we had our routine. Nobody to wave to the kids in the cars, nobody selling words of wisdom, but we kept on moving. And then one morning, my tongue didn't work the way it always had. I licked the goat man's face, the part where I could get to, but his eyes wouldn't open. I yipped a couple of times, you know, the yip kind of sharp and high in the throat, but the goat man didn't move. I nosed open the door and went out to reassure the goats, acting all businesslike, running up and down the line. The goats looked me over with their little yellow eyes as if to say, "Who do you think you are anyway? You're not the boss of us." They were right, but I didn't know what else to do. We had to go on. It was all we knew. With some badgering, the goats got themselves up and into a line more or less. They were skittish, kept waiting for the goat man's, "On, you huskies!" I nipped a few heels out of desperation, and at last we began to move. I didn't know how to stop them was the thing. I could make the move all right, but they didn't have any brakes. I kept wanting to stop so that I could check on the goat man, see if he was awake yet, but the goats kept on going. That's the thing about goats and sheep. Some children, too, if you want the truth. If you don't set your fence out there somewhere, they'll just keep going with never a thought, get themselves into all kinds of trouble. It was dark by the time the goats wore out. They had some way of talking. I never could figure out how, but suddenly they stopped, like they were all one animal. They stopped on the side of the road and plopped down. Well, I went running back to the wagon. I knew the goat man would be real hungry by then. I sure was. He'd be unwrapping the cheese, pouring us our milk. I yipped at the door to the wagon house, but the goat man didn't answer. It was harder to open the door from the outside, but at last it fell open. I hopped inside and onto his bed. Nothing had changed. The goat man was going to sleep forever. I lay down beside him then, not at his feet, where I belonged, but right up next to his dear old face. If he opened his eyes, I was going to be right there to say hello. Well, of course, by now you know he never did. We went on like that for another long day. Didn't know what else to do, neither the goats nor me. A caravan of lost souls. I knew something had to be done, but the goats surely weren't going to do it. Things were working pretty much the way they always had for them. Grass, no grass. I was the one having the hard time of it. I'd lost my best friend. No way did I need a bunch of nasty goats. Toward the end of that second day, I spotted a small barn with a house beside it. A farmer was driving a tractor through a big empty field, the earth turning in dark waves behind him. There was wash on the line, a tire swing hanging from a tree. Here were the people who could use some goats, said I. Running and fainting and dodging and sweeping, I herded those goats straight into the field. They were so surprised they didn't have time to complain. They went like sheep. The farmer came riding back on his tractor and stopped, took off his hat, scratched his head. Well, what have we here? He said. I hoped he wasn't as dumb as that. Anybody could see that what we had here was a sorry herd of goats and a broken down wagon. All things considered, I suppose I should have stayed. But the farmer had no sheep, and I was real tired of those goats. After a good meal, thanks to the farmer's wife, I headed out across the land. If I never saw another highway, well, that was fine with me. But first I had to say goodbye to the goat man. I hopped up onto the wagon, and there he was, just as I'd left him. I sniffed his curly beard, his closed eyes, his rough old hand. Storing him up for memory was what I was doing, though I didn't know it then. After a while, I hopped down and headed off, the way the goat man left Trudy. Not because I wanted to, but because it was all there was left to do. I stopped just once, turned back, and saw the farmer climbing into the wagon.